Thank you for making the time,
It's a
Paddy.
pleasure seeing you. Okay.
It's been a year since we spoke. What has been the key sort of changes, if you will, in the PE/VC industry in the last 12 months?
I think what stands out and came out in the morning discussions and including in my opening talk, because we had the benefit of some of the data for last year, is that PE and VC has been a rock in the Indian economy.
Mhm.
It's clearly become the pillar, even in spite of all the sort of negative sentiments that were there, global headwinds, as well as local concerns on liquidity, on availability of capital, on the slowdown in growth. As per the EY report, you would have saw $48 billion of capital came into India across PE, VC, other segments of investment. So in the last 3 years, I think now in a row, PE and VC has been the single largest source of FDI into India, and bigger than all other sources put together. I think we've got plenty of studies showing that PE, VC companies pay more taxes, about 30% more taxes as per estimates, create more jobs, are democratizing entrepreneurism because you have professionals now breaking out and trying to create their own businesses backed by PE and VC firms, obviously playing a big role in innovation. So I think the one thing that's become clear through last year, which was generally a weak macro year, this asset class has a very important role and contribution to make in the Indian economy going forward. And I think in some of our discussions, policyholders, they seem to recognize that, and they recognize that perhaps there's too much focus on banking capital. This is perhaps a even more important source of capital. At the same time, for this to sustain, I think what is very important is that investors, which is LPs in our parlance, see top-notch returns coming from India, which is still a bit patchy. So effectively, net dollar returns from India need to match up to the potential that everybody sees in India. I mean, one aspect of it, of course, is now you've got a more mature industry, more experienced managers doing better deals, better diligence. I think so. Gross returns, I'm hopeful, will actually match up. But then the bridge from gross to net is an important element of, for instance, taxation there. And any unpredictability in taxation, particularly, is something which unnerves people, because these investors or LPs are putting blind pool money in for 10 years. So they need that comfort that it's a very stable policy regime and nobody minds paying taxes, but it should be globally competitive. And those are some of those issues later we can talk about, where we've been quite engaged with the government on establishing the parameters for that.
So you mentioned, for example, obviously the investors need to see net good returns. Sanjay Nair this morning, I think, mentioned that they're probably in the teens. What exactly the returns are, I mean, we don't know. So that's another issue that we should talk about, which is the data availability,
I think
right?
data availability is a bit of a challenge there, but I think Sanjay and I also chatted before. I think the general feedback is actually, to be fair, that top quartile is what LPs like to look at, have been in touching the teens, the top quartile returns, whereas in some other economies, like for instance China, it's been higher in the past. Of course, maybe the last 1 or 2 years may have been a bit different. But there is a spread between what Indian top quartile returns have been and what people would like to see
And when
here.
you say teens, what roughly, I mean,
These are guesstimates. This is based on a lot of empirical feedback from LPs who've been quite active in India, but early teens is what
okay.
the
Is that enough, do you think?
no, it's not. I think
Okay.
there's no
So that,
reason why India should not be. You need to be able to match up to the best of emerging markets. B, because of low cost of leverage, the US itself has been producing pretty strong returns, and that's the easiest wins for LPs, right?
Sure.
It's home.
Sure.
They don't have to travel to do diligence. They don't have to go through all the pain. They are less likely to be questioned on their decision. Ultimately, a lot of them are answerable to bureaucrats, politicians, etc.
And you
So
can invest, one is domestic PE for US, but also you can buy an Indian ETF. You can just get exposure to the India growth story, right?
so that's the second. I'm talking about private equity for now. The second aspect is private equity, given its blind pool money for 10 years, liquidity risk, etc., needs to do better than public market.
Exactly.
So if public market, using capital asset pricing model, for instance, if you land up with expected returns in rupee terms in public markets about 15% rupee, then I think you do need that 3 to 5% more for private equity, so 18 to 20% rupee for private equity. And then you shave off maybe on average you would assume about 3% rupee depreciation against the dollar given the inflation differentials. You still need to get a slightly better return. So therefore there is a need to improve the returns, and one aspect of it is the gross returns as managers become sharper and smarter at their jobs, but the other aspect is the gross to net spread, including the tax impact.
The other thing, I think it was a recent article floating around that said that as businesses get more stable, founders or entrepreneurs are likely to also use a lot more debt capital to sort of rather than relying on equity. Would that kind of be?
I think that actually the trend is now the opposite in India, because you've had lots of blow-ups like CCD and
Mm,
many other cases
mm,
where entrepreneurs have over-leveraged
mm.
and ruined the situation. So if at all,
That's in the VC, but I'm talking about sort of later stage.
no, I mean,
No,
like CCD is not
relatively later.
it's a large business. And there've been other groups, I mean, listed groups
Mm.
which have Z
Over
Group as an
leverage, yeah, I
example,
guess,
which
yeah.
they've had to sell off
Mm,
core assets,
mm,
etc. So in fact, it's the opposite in India. I think there is now a growing concern from promoters and entrepreneurs that too much debt can unravel,
mm,
and also I think with IBC and all, there's a recognition that you can't
mm,
have a free ride with debt.
mm,
So I think people are now looking to build in adequate capital,
mhm,
equity capital into the
mm,
businesses.
mm,
So the trend is the opposite. I definitely don't see more
mm,
proclivity to take on debt.
mm, mm. Let's talk about the tax angle. What does the industry want from, apart from obviously a stable regime? What
Yeah,
exactly are you asking
yeah.
for?
I think a few things. In fact, we are very conscious that the government also has revenue targets, etc. So, for instance, I'll take one obvious one, which is GST of 18% is chargeable on the manager's fees to the fund, which is fine for to the extent you have domestic investors, but to the extent you have foreign investors, it's actually a legitimate export, and an export of high value adding service. If the pooling is done in, say, Mauritius or some other offshore destination, then typically you have the manager sitting in that offshore destination, you have advisor in India. The advisor provides the service to the manager, and that is an export, so there's no GST applicable on it. But if you bring the manager on shore and the fund in the form of an AIF, it could be that 90% of the capital is dollar capital, but because it is being simply because it's being pooled on shore, the 2% or whatever fee the manager charges will attract an 18% GST, which is a very high friction cost. This is a business which is globally mobile, so most countries recognize it, and all of them give GST or VAT rebates or refunds to the extent foreign capital is being managed in those locations. And it's actually going to be revenue accretive for the Indian government. One part of it is just the sheer nationalistic desire to bring the ecosystem onshore, but the other part of it is the manager and the fund comes onshore. A lot of the related economic activity will happen onshore, working with due diligence partners, consultants, etc. And those contracts will be billable for GST. So they are actually incremental revenue, and right now they would be billed elsewhere, perhaps. So there are elements like that, and 18% over, you have a 2% fee for
Mm,
an average 7 years in a fund. That's 14%, and if you add 18% to that, that's another
correct.
3% getting added.
Presumably, you put that to the government, and IVCA is a
Sure,
legitimate
sure.
sort of industry
Yeah.
body that the government listens to.
Yeah.
So, what is the
No, so
issue?
they're very sympathetic, quite engaged. We've actually had last 6 7 months. We've had a series of meetings with various parts of the government, MOF, Ministry of Industry, tax authorities,
Mm,
regulators, etc. I think it's a question of finally getting the ball over the line,
right.
but that final impetus is required. There are others, like for instance, which are purely administrative. Today, foreign investor invests into an AIF in India. Of course, they'll have to complete the KYC, get a PAN, etc. But what happens is that finally the fund withholds taxes every year. So they shouldn't be needing to file returns because it just becomes an administrative headache for them. They don't have people in India. The government has been visionary enough to actually allow for that for IFSCs, AIFs and IFSC, that the PAN is required, the KYC is done, withholding taxes wherever applicable have to be retained, but no need for. So some element of it is just pure administrative, which actually we just had a panel with CBDT, and he also said that that should be easy to do.
Right.
So, but we need to, we're very conscious that these are important in the next few years, and some of this needs to be done.
What else? What else is high on the agenda for the IVCA?
The third important aspect is parity between public market capital gains and private market. That's more for domestic investors and funds. Because today a domestic investor selling in his investment in his or her investment in the public market pays 10% long-term capital gains. In private markets, or the AIFs will pay 20 less indexation. That works out to a higher rate. In addition, there is the enhanced surcharge, which is applicable, which is not applicable for private markets, public markets. So it makes the tax rates higher. The third very important aspect on the agenda is just building domestic pools of capital. Today, predominantly money is coming from overseas into PEVC funds. Just like public markets, where while FPI flows have grown and tapered off, and through those ebbing of the flows, there's also been a strong SIP equivalent coming from domestic investors. It's important to build a segment of domestic investors into private equity venture capital. And one important element there would be institutional money, say pension fund money. So our request has been that now pension funds have begun to invest in public markets. Earlier they weren't even doing that, but at least open up the doors and let them test the waters on private markets, and gradually as they get comfortable, then we can look to increase that.
Do you think we're too early for that, given that EPFO is only just starting to invest incremental money?
No, so I think there are some interesting things happening. For instance, I don't know whether you heard Sujoy talk about from NIF talk about that they've created a fund of funds which invests in, so that is government money along with the other sovereigns which is investing in it. Their idea is to champion entrepreneurial private equity funds and venture capital funds. So we feel things like that are very useful because even global investors, if they know that there is like a sophisticated domestic investor who understands the lay of the land and is investing alongside in Indian PEVC funds or in AIFs, it actually has a crowding in effect because others get comfort from it. So similarly, I think if Indian pension money, even in small quantities, begins to come in, it'll give confidence to, if at all, to overseas investors. You of course need to have the right mechanisms for them to have the managers who will be able to invest that money on their behalf. But I don't think it's too early. I think it's a start which needs to be made, and it needs to be gradual for sure.
Yeah, I think they in the markets that we compare, Canada and Australia, the allocation that happens from the pension money happens from the default option or the defined benefit schemes, where there are consultants and sophisticated trustees and management teams making that allocation. Whereas here we've already gone to NPS, where we're asking the investors to choose, retail investors, that too. So I think there is a lot of education that still needs to happen for them to do
I thought
that.
that's the issue in Australia as well, because they prefer, because the investors choose, they prefer low cost options. So often they don't do it in private equity. But even in, I think if the examples you picked up, say Canada and US, I mean, you didn't talk about US, but Canada is where the pension funds themselves have a reasonable amount of expertise. US, they use consultants and gatekeepers and all. But all those markets now, you have double-digit allocation to alternative assets, actually to private equity.
But they've been investing for a while, no?
Not counting real. So I agree it needs to be gradually ramped up. It can't go, but you need to start, you need to open the gates and start and have the right mechanisms in place and start investing. And if you open the gates, you will have enough gatekeepers and consultants coming up. As long as people see there is an industry which is likely to grow, I think people will be willing to take up that job. And now you also have an ecosystem where there are enough people with experience, enough managers with experience, enough individuals with experience. Some of them may not be even continuing to work with their previous firms, etc. So I think there is enough expertise. We need to have enablers and then slowly, robustly build on it.
Mm. And do you think the Indian managers are therefore willing to share data on obviously performance and all the things that they're doing to be able to encourage this ecosystem to report on
So
them?
actually, in any case, IVCA was working on creating a benchmark for India
Mm.
on returns, and we were planning to do it on a voluntary basis. So we were having discussions with one of the global firms where, on a voluntary basis, they would get data and they would do it without charge because they
Mhm.
also felt having the
Mhm.
data is useful. It's a big name, but meanwhile, SEBI itself has decided to roll out benchmarking.
Mm.
Henceforth, but that's only applicable to AIFs. So
Mm.
those funds registered here,
Mm.
it'll not be applicable to the global funds investing in India.
Sure.
So whereas our benchmark was meant to include both
Right.
because it was voluntary anyway. So I think that's going to happen in any case
Mhm.
through this SEBI mechanism. It's mandatory sharing of data and benchmarking.
Mhm. I think it should be available in the public domain, I guess. I mean, it's not just the investors who are investing in the funds. I think there's a whole
It'll
community.
be a published
Yeah,
benchmark, so
publish,
it'll
right,
be a
right.
published benchmark. It will not
Okay.
be restricted to
Mm.
anybody because the GPs will have to pay for it.
Mm.
So it's not the LPs paying it, so it's not only available to the LPs
Right,
in this case.
right. Okay, I think on that note, I think we're good. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Pleasure
It's,
talking to you.
thank you.